Chapter 22 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 22. Why Doctors Differ. The company rearranged itself with some changes after leaving the tea-table. Dudley Venner was very polite to the widow, but that lady having been called off for a few moments for some domestic arrangement, he slid back to the side of Helen Darley, his daughter's faithful teacher. Elsie had got away by herself and was taken up in studying the stereoscopic Laocoon. Dick, being thus set free, had been seized upon by Mrs. Blanche Creamer, who had diffused herself over 3/4 of a sofa, and beckoned him to the remaining fourth. Mr. Bernard and Miss Letty were having a snug tete-a-tete in the recess of a bay window. The two doctors had taken 2 armchairs and sat squared off against each other. Their conversation is perhaps as well worth reporting as that of the rest of the company, and, as it was carried on in a louder tone, was of course more easy to gather and put on record. It was a curious sight enough to see those two representatives of 2 great professions brought face to face to talk over the subjects they had been looking at all their lives, from such different points of view. Both were old enough to have been molded by their habits of thought and life, old enough to have all their beliefs fretted in, as vintners say, thoroughly worked up with their characters. Each of them looked his calling. The Reverend Doctor had lived a good deal among books in his study. The doctor, as we will call the medical gentleman, had been riding about the country for between 30 and 40 years. His face looked tough and weather-worn, while the Reverend Doctor's, hardy as it appeared, was of finer texture. The doctor's was the graver of the two. There was something of grimness about it, partly owing to the northeasters he had faced for so many years, partly to long companionship with that stern personage who never deals in sentiment or pleasantry. His speech was apt to be brief and peremptory. It was a way he had got by ordering patients. But he could discourse somewhat on occasion, as the reader may find out. The Reverend Doctor had an open, smiling expression, a cheery voice, a hearty laugh, and a cordial way with him which some thought too lively for his cloth, but which children, who are good judges of such matters, delighted in, so that he was the favorite of all the little rogues about town. But he had the clerical art of sobering down in a moment when asked to say grace while somebody was in the middle of some particularly funny story, and though his voice was so cheery in common talk in the pulpit, like almost all preachers, he had a wholly different and peculiar way of speaking, supposed to be more acceptable to the Creator than the natural manner. In point of fact, most of our anti-papal and anti-prelatical clergymen do really intone their prayers, without suspecting in the least that they have fallen into such a Romish practice. This is the way the conversation between the Doctor of Divinity and the Doctor of Medicine was going on at the point where these notes take it up. Obi tres medici duo athiae, you know, Doctor, your profession has always had the credit of being lax in doctrine, though pretty stringent in practice. Ha, ha! Some priest said that, the doctor answered dryly. They always talked Latin when they had a bigger lie than common to get rid of. Good, said the Reverend Doctor. I'm afraid they would lie a little sometimes. But isn't there some truth in it, Doctor? Don't you think your profession is apt to see nature in the place of the God of nature, to lose sight of the great first cause in their daily study of secondary causes? I've thought about that, the doctor answered, and I've talked about it and read about it, and I've come to the conclusion that nobody believes in God and trusts in God quite so much as the doctors. Only it isn't just the sort of deity that some of your profession have wanted them to take up with. There was a student of mine wrote a dissertation on the natural theology of health and disease, and took that old lying proverb for his motto. He knew a good deal more about books than ever I did, and had studied in other countries. I'll tell you what he said about it. He said the old heathen doctor, Galen, praised God for his handiwork in the human body, just as if he had been a Christian, or the psalmist himself. He said they had this sentence set up in large letters in the great lecture room in Paris, where he attended: "I dressed his wound, and God healed him." That was an old surgeon's saying, and he gave a long list of doctors who were not only Christians, but famous ones. I grant you, though, ministers and doctors are very apt to see differently in spiritual matters. "That's it," said the Reverend Doctor. "You are apt to see nature where we see God, and appeal to science where we are contented with revelation." "We don't separate God and nature, perhaps, as you do," the doctor answered. "When we say that God is omnipresent and omnipotent and omniscient, we are a little more apt to mean it than your folks are. We think, when a wound heals, that God's presence and power and knowledge are there, healing it, just as that old surgeon did. We think a good many theologians, working among their books, don't see the facts of the world they live in. When we tell 'em of these facts, they are apt to call us materialists and atheists and infidels, and all that. We can't help seeing the facts, and we don't think it's wicked to mention 'em." "Do tell me," the Reverend Doctor said, "some of these facts we are in the habit of overlooking, and which your profession thinks it can see and understand." "That's very easy," the doctor replied. "For instance, you don't understand or don't allow for idiosyncrasies, as we learn to. We know that food and physic act differently with different people, but you think the same kind of truth is going to suit, or ought to suit, all minds. We don't fight with a patient because he can't take magnesia or opium, but you are all the time quarreling over your beliefs, as if belief did not depend very much on race and constitution, to say nothing of early training. Do you mean to say that every man is not absolutely free to choose his beliefs? The men you write about in your studies are, but not the men we see in the real world. There is some apparently congenital defect in the Indians, for instance, that keeps them from choosing civilization and Christianity. So with the gypsies, very likely. Everybody knows that Catholicism or Protestantism is a good deal a matter of race. Constitution has more to do with belief than people think for. I went to a Universalist church when I was in the city one day to hear a famous man whom all the world knows, and I never saw such pews full of broad shoulders and florid faces, and substantial, wholesome-looking persons, male and female, in all my life. Why, it was astonishing. Either their creed made them healthy, or they chose it because they were healthy. Your folks have never got the hang of human nature. I am afraid this would be considered a degrading and dangerous view of human beliefs and responsibility for them, the Reverend Doctor replied. Prove to a man that his will is governed by something outside of himself, and you have lost all hold on his moral and religious nature. There is nothing bad men want to believe so much as that they are governed by necessity. Now, that which is at once degrading and dangerous cannot be true. No doubt, the doctor replied. All large views of mankind limit our estimate of the absolute freedom of the will. But I don't think it degrades or endangers us, for this reason that, while it makes us charitable to the rest of mankind, our own sense of freedom, whatever it is never affected by argument. Conscience won't be reasoned with. We feel that we can practically do this or that, and if we choose the wrong, we know we are responsible. But observation teaches us this or that other race or individual has not the same practical freedom of choice. I don't see how we can avoid this conclusion in the instance of the American Indians. The science of ethnology has upset a good many theoretical notions about human nature. "Science," said the Reverend Doctor, "science! That was a word the Apostle Paul did not seem to think much of, if we may judge by the Epistle to Timothy. Oppositions of science, falsely so called. I own that I am jealous of that word and the pretensions that go with it. Science has seemed to me to be very often only the handmaid of skepticism." "Doctor," the physician said emphatically, "science is knowledge. Nothing that is not known properly belongs to science. Whenever knowledge obliges us to doubt, we are always safe in doubting. Astronomers foretell eclipses, say how long comets are to stay with us, point out where a new planet is to be found. We see they know what they assert, and the poor old Roman Catholic Church has at last to knock under. So geology proves a certain succession of events, and the best Christian in the world must make the earth's history square with it. Besides, I don't think you remember what great revelations of himself the Creator has made in the minds of the men who have built up science. You seem to me to hold his human masterpieces very cheap. Don't you think the inspiration of the Almighty gave Newton and Cuvier understanding?" The Reverend Doctor was not arguing for victory. In fact, what he wanted was to call out the opinions of the old physician by a show of opposition, being already predisposed to agree with many of them. He was rather trying the common arguments, as one tries tricks of fence, merely to learn the way of parrying. But just here he saw a tempting opening, and could not resist giving a home thrust. "Yes, but you surely could not consider it inspiration of the same kind as that of the writers of the Old Testament?" That cornered the doctor, and he paused a moment before he replied. Then he raised his head, so as to command the Reverend Doctor's face through his spectacles, and said, "I did not say that. You are clear, I suppose, that the Omniscient spoke through Solomon, but that Shakespeare wrote without his help." The Reverend Doctor looked very grave. It was a bold, blunt way of putting the question. He turned it aside with the remark that Shakespeare seemed to him at times to come as near inspiration as any human being not included among the sacred writers. "Doctor," the physician began, as from a sudden suggestion, "you won't quarrel with me if I tell you some of my real thoughts, will you?" "Say on, my dear sir, say on," the minister answered, with his most genial smile. "Your real thoughts are just what I want to get at. A man's real thoughts are a great rarity. If I don't agree with you, I shall like to hear you." The doctor began, and in order to give his thoughts more connectedly, we will omit the conversational breaks, the questions and comments of the clergyman, and all accidental interruptions. When the old ecclesiastic said that where there were 3 doctors, there were 2 atheists, they lied, of course. They called everybody who differed from them atheists, until they found out that not believing in God wasn't nearly so ugly a crime as not believing in some particular dogma. Then they called them heretics, until so many good people had been burned under that name that it began to smell too strong of roasting flesh. And after that, infidels, which properly means people without faith, of whom there are not a great many in any place or time. But then, of course, there was some reason why doctors shouldn't think about religion exactly as ministers did, or they never would have made that proverb. It's very likely that something of the same kind is true now. Whether it is so or not, I am going to tell you the reasons why it would not be strange if doctors should take rather different views from clergymen about some matters of belief. I don't, of course, mean all doctors, nor all clergymen. Some doctors go as far as any old New England divine, and some clergymen agree very well with the doctors that think least according to rule. To begin with, their ideas of the Creator himself. They always see him trying to help his creatures out of their troubles. A man no sooner gets a cut than the great physician, whose agency we often call nature, goes to work, first to stop the blood, and then to heal the wound, and then to make the scar as small as possible. If a man's pain exceeds a certain amount, he faints, and so gets relief. If it lasts too long, habit comes in to make it tolerable. If it is altogether too bad, he dies. That is the best thing to be done under the circumstances. So you see, the doctor is constantly in presence of a benevolent agency working against a settled order of things, of which pain and disease are the accidents, so to speak. Well, no doubt they find it harder than clergymen to believe that there can be any world or state from which this benevolent agency is wholly excluded. This may be very wrong, but it is not unnatural. They can hardly conceive of a permanent state of being in which cuts would never try to heal, nor habit render suffering endurable. This is one effect of their training. Then again, their attention is very much called to human limitations. Ministers work out the machinery of responsibility in an abstract kind of way. They have a sort of algebra of human nature in which friction and strength or weakness of material are left out. You see, a doctor is in the way of studying children from the moment of birth upwards. For the first year or so, he sees that they are just as much pupils of their Maker as the young of any other animals. Well, their Maker trains them to pure selfishness. Why? In order that they may be sure to take care of themselves. So you see, when a child comes to be, we will say a year and a day old, and makes his first choice between right and wrong, he is at a disadvantage, for he has that vis a tergo, as we doctors call it, that force from behind of a whole year's life of selfishness, for which he is no more to blame than a calf is to blame for having lived in the same way, purely to gratify his natural appetites. Then we see that baby grow up to a child, and if he is fat and stout and red and lively, we expect to find him troublesome and noisy, and perhaps sometimes disobedient more or less. That's the way each new generation breaks its eggshell. But if he is very weak and thin, and is one of the kind that may be expected to die early, he will very likely sit in the house all day and read good books about other little sharp-faced children just like himself, who died early, having always been perfectly indifferent to all the outdoor amusements of the wicked little red-cheeked children. Some of the little folks we watch grow up to be young women, and occasionally one of them gets nervous, what we call hysterical, and then that girl will begin to play all sorts of pranks, to lie and cheat perhaps, in the most unaccountable way, so that she might seem to a minister a good example of total depravity. We don't see her in that light. We give her iron and valerian, and get her on horseback if we can, and so expect to make her will come all right again. By and by we are called in to see an old baby, 80 years and 10 or more old. We find this old baby has never got rid of that first year's teaching, which led him to fill his stomach with all he could pump into it, and his hands with everything he could grab. People call him a miser. We are sorry for him, but we can't help remembering his first year's training and the natural effect of money on the great majority of those that have it. So while the ministers say, "He shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven," we like to remind them that with God all things are possible. Once more, we see all kinds of monomania and insanity. We learn from them to recognize all sorts of queer tendencies in minds supposed to be sane, so that we have nothing but compassion for a large class of persons condemned as sinners by theologians, but considered by us as invalids. We have constant reasons for noticing the transmission of qualities from parents to offspring, and we find it hard to hold a child accountable in any moral point of view for inherited bad temper or tendency to drunkenness, as hard as we should to blame him for inheriting gout or asthma. I suppose we are more lenient with human nature than theologians generally are. We know that the spirits of men and their views of the present and the future go up and down with the barometer, and that a permanent depression of 1 inch in the mercurial column would affect the whole theology of Christendom. Ministers talk about the human will as if it stood on a high lookout with plenty of light and elbow room reaching to the horizon. Doctors are constantly noticing how it is tied up and darkened by inferior organization, by disease, and all sorts of crowding interferences, until they get to look upon Hottentots and Indians, and a good many of their own race, as a kind of self-conscious blood clocks, with very limited power of self-determination. That's the tendency, I say, of a doctor's experience. But the people to whom they address their statements of the results of their observation belong to the thinking class of the highest races, and they are conscious of a great deal of liberty of will. So in the face of the fact that civilization, with all it offers, has proved a dead failure with the aboriginal races of this country, on the whole, I say a dead failure, they talk as if they knew from their own will all about that of a digger Indian. We are more apt to go by observation of the facts in the case. We are constantly seeing weakness where you see depravity. I don't say we're right. I only tell you what you must often find to be the fact, right or wrong, in talking with doctors. You see, too, our notions of bodily and moral disease or sin are apt to go together. We used to be as hard on sickness as you were on sin. We know better now. We don't look at sickness as we used to, and try to poison it with everything that is offensive, burnt toads and earthworms and viper broth and worse things than these. We know that disease has something back of it which the body isn't to blame for, at least in most cases, and which very often it is trying to get rid of. Just so with sin. I will agree to take 100 newborn babes of a certain stock and return 75 of them in a dozen years, true and honest, if not pious children. And I will take another 100 of a different stock and put them in the hands of a certain Ann Street or 5 Points teachers, and 75 of them will be thieves and liars at the end of the same dozen years. I have heard of an old character, Colonel Jocks, I believe it was, a famous cattle breeder, who used to say he could breed to pretty much any pattern he wanted to. Well, we doctors see so much of families, how the tricks of the blood keep breaking out, just as much in character as they do in looks, that we can't help feeling as if a great many people hadn't a fair chance to be what is called good, and that there isn't a text in the Bible better worth keeping always in mind than that one, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." As for our getting any quarter at the hands of theologians, we don't expect it, and have no right to. You don't give each other any quarter. I have had 2 religious books sent me by friends within a week or 2. One is Mr. Brownson's. He is as fair and square as Euclid, a real honest, strong thinker, and one that knows what he is talking about, for he has tried all sorts of religions pretty much. He tells us that the Roman Catholic Church is the one through which alone we can hope for heaven. The other is by a worthy Episcopal rector who appears to write as if he were in earnest, and he calls the papacy the devil's masterpiece, and talks about the satanic scheme of that very church through which alone, as Mr. Brownson tells us, we can hope for heaven. What's the use in our caring about hard words after this? Atheists, heretics, infidels, and the like. They are, after all, only the cinders picked up out of those heaps of ashes round in the stumps of the old stakes, where they used to burn men, women, and children, for not thinking just like other folks. They'll crock your fingers, but they can't burn us. Doctors are the best-natured people in the world, except when they get fighting with each other, and they have some advantages over you. You inherit your notions from a set of priests that had no wives and no children, or none to speak of, and so let their humanity die out of them. It didn't seem much to them to condemn a few thousand millions of people to purgatory or worse for a mistake of judgment. They didn't know what it was to have a child look up in their faces and say, "Father." It will take you 100 or 2 more years to get decently humanized after so many centuries of dehumanizing celibacy. Besides, though our libraries are perhaps not commonly quite so big as yours, God opens one book to physicians that a good many of you don't know much about, the Book of Life. That is none of your dusty folios with black letters between pasteboard and leather, but it is printed in bright red type, and the binding of it is warm and tender to every touch. They reverence that book as one of the Almighty's infallible revelations. They will insist on reading you lessons out of it, whether you call them names or not. These will always be lessons of charity. No doubt nothing can be more provoking to listen to. But do beg your folks to remember that the Smithfield fires are all out, and that the cinders are very dirty and not in the least dangerous. They'd a great deal better be civil and not be throwing old proverbs in the doctors' faces when they say that the man of the old monkish notions is one thing, and the man they watch from his cradle to his coffin is something very different. It has cost a good deal of trouble to work the doctor's talk up into this formal shape. Some of his sentences have been rounded off for him, and the whole brought into a more rhetorical form than it could have pretended to, if taken as it fell from his lips. But the exact course of his remarks has been followed, and as far as possible his expressions have been retained. Though given in the form of a discourse, it must be remembered that this was a conversation, much more fragmentary and colloquial than it seems as just read. The Reverend Doctor was very far from taking offense at the old physician's freedom of speech. He knew him to be honest, kind, charitable, self-denying, whenever any sorrow was to be alleviated, always reverential, with a cheerful trust in the great Father of all mankind. To be sure, his senior deacon, old Deacon Shearer, who seemed to have got his scripture teachings out of the Vinegar Bible, the one where vineyard is misprinted vinegar, which a good many people seem to have adopted as the true reading. His senior deacon had called Dr. Kittredge an infidel, but the Reverend Doctor could not help feeling that, unless the text, "By their truths ye shall know them," were an interpolation, the doctor was the better Christian of the two. Whatever his senior deacon might think about it, he said to himself that he shouldn't be surprised if he met the doctor in heaven yet, inquiring anxiously after old Deacon Shearer. He was on the point of expressing himself very frankly to the doctor, with that benevolent smile on his face which had sometimes come near giving offence to the readers of the Vinegar edition, but he saw that the physician's attention had been arrested by Elsie. He looked in the same direction himself, and could not help being struck by her attitude and expression. There was something singularly graceful in the curves of her neck and the rest of her figure, but she was so perfectly still that it seemed as if she were hardly breathing. Her eyes were fixed on the young girl with whom Mr. Bernard was talking. He had often noticed their brilliancy, but now it seemed to him that they appeared dull, and the look on her features was as of some passion which had missed its stroke. Mr. Bernard's companion seemed unconscious that she was the object of this attention, and was listening to the young master as if he had succeeded in making himself very agreeable. Of course Dick Venner had not mistaken the game that was going on. The schoolmaster meant to make Elsie jealous, and he had done it. That's it. Get her savage first, and then come wheedling round her. A sure trick, if he isn't headed off somehow. But Dick saw well enough that he had better let Elsie alone just now, and thought the best way of killing the evening would be to amuse himself in a little lively talk with Mrs. Blanche Creamer, and incidentally to show Elsie that he could make himself acceptable to other women, if not to herself. The doctor presently went up to Elsie, determined to engage her in conversation and get her out of her thoughts, which he saw by her look were dangerous. Her father had been on the point of leaving Helen Darley to go to her, but felt easy enough when he saw the old doctor at her side, and so went on talking. The Reverend Doctor, being now left alone, engaged the widow Rowens, who put the best face on her vexation she could, but was devoting herself to all the underground deities for having been such a fool as to ask that pale-faced thing from the Institute to fill up her party. There is no space left to report the rest of the conversation. If there was anything of any significance in it, it will turn up by and by, no doubt. At 10 o'clock the Reverend Doctor called Miss Letty, who had no idea it was so late. Mr. Bernard gave his arm to Helen. Mr. Richard saw to Mrs. Blanche Creamer. The doctor gave Elsie a cautioning look, and went off alone, thoughtful. Dudley Venner and his daughter got into their carriage and were whirled away. The widow's gambit was played, and she had not won the game. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 23. The Wild Huntsman. The young master had not forgotten the old doctor's cautions. Without attributing any great importance to the warning he had given him, Mr. Bernard had so far complied with his advice that he was becoming a pretty good shot with the pistol. It was an amusement as good as many others to practice, and he had taken a fancy to it after the first few days. The popping of a pistol at odd hours in the backyard of the Institute was a phenomenon more than sufficiently remarkable to be talked about in Rockland. The vicious intelligence of a country village is not easily stirred by the winds which ripple the fluent thought of great cities, but it holds every straw and entangles every insect that lights upon it. It soon became rumored in the town that the young master was a wonderful shot with the pistol. Some said he could hit a fourpence halfpenny at 3 rod. Some that he had shot a swallow flying with a single ball. Some that he snuffled a candle 5 times out of 6 at 10 paces, and that he could hit any button in a man's coat he wanted to. In other words, as in all such cases, all the common feats were ascribed to him, as the current jokes of the day are laid at the door of any noted wit, however innocent he may be of them. In the natural course of things, Mr. Richard Venner, who had by this time made some acquaintances, as we have seen, among that class of the population least likely to allow a live cinder of gossip to go out for want of air, had heard incidentally that the master up there at the Institute was all the time practising with a pistol, that they say he can snuff a candle at 10 rods. That was Mrs. Blanche Creamer's version, and that he could hit anybody he wanted to right in the eye, as far as he could see the white of it. Dick did not like the sound of all this any too well. Without believing more than half of it, there was enough to make the Yankee schoolmaster too unsafe to be trifled with. However, shooting at a mark was pleasant work enough. He had no particular objection to it himself, only he did not care so much for those little pop-gun affairs that a man carries in his pocket, and with which you couldn't shoot a fellow, a robber, say, without getting the muzzle under his nose. Pistols for boys, long-range rifles for men. There was such a gun lying in a closet with the fowling pieces. He would go out into the fields and see what he could do as a marksman. The nature of the mark which Dick chose for experimenting upon was singular. He had found some panes of glass which had been removed from an old sash, and he placed these successively before his target, arranging them at different angles. He found that a bullet would go through the glass without glancing or having its force materially abated. It was an interesting fact in physics, and might prove of some practical significance hereafter. Nobody knows what may turn up to render these out-of-the-way facts useful. All this was done in a quiet way in one of the bare spots high up on the side of the mountain. He was very thoughtful in taking the precaution to get so far away. Rifle bullets are apt to glance and come whizzing about people's ears if they are fired in the neighborhood of houses. Dick satisfied himself that he could be tolerably sure of hitting a pane of glass at a distance of 30 rods, more or less, and that if there happened to be anything behind it, the glass would not materially alter the force or direction of the bullet. About this time it occurred to him also that there was an old accomplishment of his which he would be in danger of losing for want of practice, if he did not take some opportunity to try his hand and regain its cunning, if it had begun to be diminished by disuse. For his first trial he chose an evening when the moon was shining, and after the hour when the Rockland people were like to be stirring abroad. He was so far established now that he could do much as he pleased without exciting remark. The prairie horse he rode, the mustang of the pampas, wild as he was, had been trained to take part in at least one exercise. This was the accomplishment in which Mr. Richard now proposed to try himself. For this purpose he sought the implement of which, as it may be remembered, he had once made an incidental use, the lasso, or the long strip of hide with a slip noose at the end of it. He had been accustomed to playing with such a thong from his boyhood, and had become expert in its use in capturing wild cattle in the course of his adventures. Unfortunately, there were no wild bulls likely to be met with in the neighborhood to become the subjects of his skill. A stray cow in the road, an ox or a horse in a pasture must serve his turn, dull beasts, but moving marks to aim at any rate. Never, since he had galloped in the chase over the pampas, had Dick Venner felt such a sense of life and power as when he struck the long spurs into his wild horse's flanks, and dashed along the road with the lasso lying like a coiled snake at the saddle bow. In skilful hands, the silent, bloodless noose, flying like an arrow, but not like that leaving a wound behind it, sudden as a pistol shot, but without the telltale explosion, is one of the most fearful and mysterious weapons that arm the hand of man. The old Romans knew how formidable, even in contest with a gladiator equipped with sword, helmet, and shield, was the almost naked retiarius, with his net in one hand and his three-pronged javelin in the other. Once get a net over a man's head, or a cord round his neck, or, what is more frequently done nowadays, bonnet him by knocking his hat down over his eyes, and he is at the mercy of his opponent. Our soldiers who served against the Mexicans found this out too well. Many a poor fellow has been lassoed by the fierce riders from the plains, and fallen an easy victim to the captor who had snared him in the fatal noose. But imposing as the sight of the wild huntsman of the Pampas might have been, Dick could not help laughing at the mock sublimity of his situation, as he tried his first experiment on an unhappy milky mother who had strayed from her herd and was wandering disconsolately along the road, laying the dust as she went with thready streams from her swollen swinging udders. "Here goes the Don at the windmill," said Dick, and tilted full speed at her, whirling the lasso round his head as he rode. The creature swerved to one side of the way as the wild horse and his rider came rushing down upon her, and presently turned and ran, as only cows, and it wouldn't be safe to say it, can run. Just before he passed, at 20 or 30 feet from her, the lasso shot from his hand, uncoiling as it flew, and in an instant its loop was round her horns. "Well cast," said Dick, as he galloped up to her side and dexterously disengaged the lasso. "Now for a horse on the run." He had the good luck to find one, presently, grazing in a pasture at the roadside. Taking down the rails of the fence at one point, he drove the horse into the road and gave chase. It was a lively young animal enough, and was easily roused to a pretty fast pace. As his gallop grew more and more rapid, Dick gave the reins to the mustang until the two horses stretched themselves out in their longest strides. If the first feat looked like play, the one he was now to attempt had a good deal the appearance of real work. He touched the mustang with the spur, and in a few fierce leaps found himself nearly abreast of the frightened animal he was chasing. Once more he whirled the lasso round and round over his head, and then shot it forth, as the rattlesnake shoots his head from the loops against which it rests. The noose was round the horse's neck, and in another instant was tightened so as almost to stop his breath. The prairie horse knew the trick of the cord, and leaned away from the captive, so as to keep the thong tensely stretched between his neck and the peak of the saddle to which it was fastened. Struggling was of no use with a halter round his windpipe, and he very soon began to tremble and stagger, blind no doubt, and with a roaring in his ears as of 1,000 battle trumpets, at any rate subdued and helpless. That was enough. Dick loosened his lasso, wound it up again, laid it like a pet snake in a coil at his saddle bow, turned his horse, and rode slowly along towards the mansion house. The place had never looked more stately and beautiful to him than as he now saw it in the moonlight. The undulations of the land, the grand mountain screen which sheltered the mansion from the northern blasts, rising with all its hanging forests and parapets of naked rock high towards the heavens, the ancient mansion with its square chimneys and bodyguard of old trees, and cincture of low walls with marble pillared gateways, the fields with their various coverings, the beds of flowers, the plots of turf, one with a grey column in its centre bearing a sundial, on which the rays of the moon were idly shining, another with a white stone and a narrow ridge of turf. Over all these objects, harmonized with all their infinite details into one fair whole by the moonlight, the prospective heir, as he deemed himself, looked with admiring eyes. But while he looked, the thought rose up in his mind like waters from a poisoned fountain, that there was a deep plot laid to cheat him of the inheritance which by a double claim he meant to call his own. Every day this ice-cold beauty, this dangerous, handsome cousin of his, went up to that place, that usher's girl-trap. Every day, regularly now. It used to be different. Did she go only to get out of his or her cousin's reach? Was she not rather becoming more and more involved in the toils of this plotting Yankee? If Mr. Bernard had shown himself at that moment a few rods in advance, the chances are that in less than 1 minute he would have found himself with a noose round his neck, at the heels of a mounted horseman. Providence spared him for the present. Mr. Richard rode his horse quietly round to the stable, put him up, and proceeded towards the house. He got to his bed without disturbing the family, but could not sleep. The idea had fully taken possession of his mind that a deep intrigue was going on, which would end by bringing Elsie and the schoolmaster into relations fatal to all his own hopes. With that ingenuity which always accompanies jealousy, he tortured every circumstance of the last few weeks, so as to make it square with this belief. From this vein of thought he naturally passed to a consideration of every possible method by which the issue he feared might be avoided. Mr. Richard talked very plain language with himself in all these inward soliloquies. Supposing it came to the worst, what could be done then? First, an accident might happen to the schoolmaster, which should put a complete and final check upon his projects and contrivances. The particular accident which might interrupt his career must, evidently, be determined by circumstances, but it must be of a nature to explain itself without the necessity of any particular persons becoming involved in the matter. It would be unpleasant to go into particulars, but everybody knows well enough that men sometimes get in the way of a stray bullet, and that young persons occasionally do violence to themselves in various modes, by firearms, suspension, and other means, in consequence of disappointment in love, perhaps, oftener than from other motives. There was still another kind of accident which might serve his purpose. If anything should happen to Elsie, it would be the most natural thing in the world that his uncle should adopt him, his nephew and only near relation, as his heir, unless, indeed, Uncle Dudley should take it into his head to marry again. In that case, where would he, Dick, be? This was the most detestable complication which he could conceive of, and yet he had noticed, he could not help noticing, that his uncle had been very attentive to, and, as it seemed, very much pleased with, that young woman from the school. What did that mean? Was it possible that he was going to take a fancy to her? It made him wild to think of all the several contingencies which might defraud him of that good fortune which seemed but just now within his grasp. He glared in the darkness at imaginary faces, sometimes at that of the handsome, treacherous schoolmaster, sometimes at that of the meek-looking, but no doubt scheming, lady-teacher, sometimes at that of the dark girl whom he was ready to make his wife, sometimes at that of his much-respected uncle, who, of course, could not be allowed to peril the fortunes of his relatives by forming a new connection. It was a frightful perplexity in which he found himself, because there was no one single life an accident to which would be sufficient to ensure the fitting and natural course of descent to the great Dudley property. If it had been a simple question of helping forward a casualty to any one person, there was nothing in Dick's habit of thought and living to make that a serious difficulty. He had been so much with lawless people that a life between his wish and his object seemed only as an obstacle to be removed, provided the object were worth the risk and trouble. But if there were 2 or 3 lives in the way, manifestly that altered the case. His southern blood was getting impatient. There was enough of the New Englander about him to make him calculate his chances before he struck. But his plans were liable to be defeated at any moment by a passionate impulse, such as the dark-hued races of southern Europe and their descendants are liable to. He lay in his bed, sometimes arranging plans to meet the various difficulties already mentioned, sometimes getting into a paroxysm of blind rage in the perplexity of considering what object he should select as the one most clearly in his way. On the whole, there could be no doubt where the most threatening of all his embarrassments lay. It was in the probable growing relation between Elsie and the schoolmaster. If it should prove, as it seemed likely, that there was springing up a serious attachment tending to a union between them, he knew what he should do, if he was not quite so sure how he should do it. There was one thing at least which might favor his projects, and which, at any rate, would serve to amuse him. He could, by a little quiet observation, find out what were the schoolmaster's habits of life, whether he had any routine which could be calculated upon, and under what circumstances a strictly private interview of a few minutes with him might be reckoned on, in case it should be desirable. He could also very probably learn some facts about Elsie, whether the young man was in the habit of attending her on her way home from school, whether she stayed about the schoolroom after the other girls had gone, and any incidental matters of interest which might present themselves. He was getting more and more restless for want of some excitement. A mad gallop, a visit to Mrs. Blanche Creamer, who had taken such a fancy to him, or a chat with the widow Rowens, who was very lively in her talk, for all her sombre colors, and reminded him a good deal of some of his earlier friends, the Señoritas. All these were distractions, to be sure, but not enough to keep his fiery spirit from fretting itself in longings for more dangerous excitements. The thought of getting a knowledge of all Mr. Bernard's ways, so that he would be in his power at any moment, was a happy one. For some days after this he followed Elsie at a long distance behind, to watch her until she got to the schoolhouse. One day he saw Mr. Bernard join her, a mere accident very probably, for it was only once this happened. She came on her homeward way alone, quite apart from the groups of girls who strolled out of the schoolhouse yard in company. Sometimes she was behind them all, which was suggestive. Could she have stayed to meet the schoolmaster? If he could have smuggled himself into the school, he would have liked to watch her there, and see if there was not some understanding between her and the master, which betrayed itself by look or word. But this was beyond the limits of his audacity, and he had to content himself with such cautious observations as could be made at a distance. With the aid of a pocket glass he could make out persons without the risk of being observed himself. Mr. Silas Peckham's corps of instructors was not expected to be off duty or to stand at ease for any considerable length of time. Sometimes Mr. Bernard, who had more freedom than the rest, would go out for a ramble in the daytime, but more frequently it would be in the evening, after the hour of retiring, as bedtime was elegantly termed by the young ladies of the Apollinean Institute. He would then not unfrequently walk out alone in the common roads, or climb up the sides of the mountain, which seemed to be one of his favorite resorts. Here, of course, it was impossible to follow him with the eye at any distance. Dick had a hideous, gnawing suspicion that somewhere in these deep shades the schoolmaster might meet Elsie, whose evening wanderings he knew so well. But of this he was not able to assure himself. Secrecy was necessary to his present plans, and he could not compromise himself by over-eager curiosity. One thing he learned with certainty. The master returned after his walk one evening, and entered the building where his room was situated. Presently a light betrayed the window of his apartment. From a wooded bank, some 30 or 40 rods from this building, Dick Venner could see the interior of the chamber, and watch the master as he sat at his desk, the light falling strongly upon his face, intent upon the book or manuscript before him. Dick contemplated him very long in this attitude. The sense of watching his every motion, himself meanwhile utterly unseen, was delicious. How little the master was thinking what eyes were on him! Well, there were two things quite certain. One was that, if he chose, he could meet the schoolmaster alone, either in the road or in a more solitary place, if he preferred to watch his chance for an evening or two. The other was that he commanded his position as he sat at his desk in the evening in such a way that there would be very little difficulty, so far as that went. Of course, however, silence is always preferable to noise, and there is a great difference in the marks left by different casualties. Very likely nothing would come of all this espionage, but at any rate, the first thing to be done with a man you want to have in your power is to learn his habits. Since the tea party at the widow Rowan's, Elsie had been more fitful and moody than ever. Dick understood all this well enough, you know. It was the working of her jealousy against that young schoolgirl to whom the master had devoted himself for the sake of piquing the heiress of the Dudley mansion. Was it possible in any way to exasperate her irritable nature against him, and in this way to render her more accessible to his own advances? It was difficult to influence her at all. She endured his company without seeming to enjoy it. She watched him with that strange look of hers, sometimes as if she were on her guard against him, sometimes as if she would like to strike at him, as in that fit of childish passion. She ordered him about with a haughty indifference, which reminded him of his own way with the dark-eyed women whom he had known so well of old. All this added a secret pleasure to the other motives he had for worrying her with jealous suspicions. He knew she brooded silently on any grief that poisoned her comfort, that she fed on it, as it were, until it ran with every drop of blood in her veins, and that, except in some paroxysm of rage, of which he himself was not likely the second time to be the object, or in some deadly vengeance wrought secretly, against which he would keep a sharp lookout, so far as he was concerned, she had no outlet for her dangerous, smouldering passions. Beware of the woman who cannot find free utterance for all her stormy inner life, either in words or song. So long as a woman can talk, there is nothing she cannot bear. If she cannot have a companion to listen to her woes, and has no musical utterance, vocal or instrumental, then, if she is one of the real woman sort, and has a few heartfuls of wild blood in her, and you have done her a wrong, double bolt the door which she may enter on noiseless slipper at midnight. Look twice before you taste of any cup whose draught the shadow of her hand may have darkened. But let her talk, and above all cry, or if she is one of the coarser-grained tribe, give her the run of all the red-hot expletives in the language, and let her blister her lips with them until she is tired. She will sleep like a lamb after it, and you may take a cup of coffee from her without stirring it up to look for its sediment. So, if she can sing or play on any musical instrument, all her wickedness will run off through her throat or the tips of her fingers. How many tragedies find their peaceful catastrophe in fierce roulades and strenuous bravuras! How many murders are executed in double quick time upon the keys which stab the air with their dagger strokes of sound? What would our civilization be without the piano? Are not Erard and Broadwood and Chickering the true humanizers of our time? Therefore do I love to hear the all-pervading turn jarring the walls of little parlors in houses with double door-plates on their portals, looking out on streets and courts, which to know is to be unknown, and where to exist is not to live, according to any true definition of living. Therefore complain I not of modern degeneracy, when, even from the open window of the small unlovely farmhouse, tenanted by the hard-handed man of bovine flavors, and the flat-patterned woman of broken-down countenance, issue the same familiar sounds. For who knows that Elmira, but for these days, which throb away her wild impulses in harmless discords, would not have been floating dead in the brown stream which slides through the meadows by her father's door, or living with that other current which runs beneath the gaslights, over the slimy pavement, choking with wretched weeds that were once in spotless flower. Poor Elsie! She never sang nor played. She never shaped her inner life in words. Such utterance was as much denied to her nature as common articulate speech to the deaf-mute. Her only language must be in action. Watch her well by day and by night, old Sophy, watch her well, or the long line of her honored name may close in shame, and the stately mansion of the Dudleys remain a hissing and a reproach till its roof is buried in its cellar. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 24. On His Track. "Abel," said the old doctor one morning, "after you've harnessed Caustic, come into the study a few minutes, will you?" Abel nodded. He was a man of few words, and he knew that the "will you" did not require an answer, being the true New England way of rounding the corners of an employer's order, a tribute to the personal independence of an American citizen. The hired man came into the study in the course of a few minutes. His face was perfectly still, and he wanted to be spoken to, but the doctor's eye detected a certain meaning in his expression, which looked as if he had something to communicate. "Well?" said the doctor. "He's up to mischief of some kind, I guess," said Abel. "I just happened down by the mansion house last night, and he come out o' the gate on that queer lookin' creatur' of his. I watched him, and he rid very slow all round by the Institute, and acted as if he was spyin' about. He looks to me like a man that's calculatin' to do some kind of ill turn to somebody. I shouldn't like to have him round me if there wasn't a pitchfork or an eel spear or some sech weapon within reach. He may be all right, but I don't like his looks, and I don't see what he's lurkin' round the Institute for after folks is abed." "Have you watched him pretty close for the last few days?" said the doctor. "Well, yes, I've had my eye on him considerable of the time. I have to be pretty shy about it, or he'll find out that I'm on his tracks. I don't want him to get a spite against me, if I can help it. He looks to me like one o' them kind that carries what they call slung shot, and hits ye on the side o' the head with 'em, so sudden ye never know what hurt ye." "Why?" said the doctor sharply. "Have you ever seen him with any such weapon about him?" "Well, no, I can't say that I have," Abel answered, "only he looks kind o' dangerous. Maybe he's all jest as he ought to be. I can't say that he ain't, but he's out late nights, and lurkin' round, jest as if he was spyin' somebody, and somehow I can't help mistrustin' them Portugee lookin' fellahs. I can't keep the run of this chap all the time, but I've a notion that old black woman down to the mansion house knows as much about him as anybody." The doctor paused a moment after hearing this report from his private detective, and then got into his chaise and turned Caustic's head in the direction of the Dudley mansion. He had been suspicious of Dick from the first. He did not like his mixed blood, nor his looks, nor his ways. He had formed a conjecture about his projects early. He had made a shrewd guess as to the probable jealousy Dick would feel of the schoolmaster, had found out something of his movements, and had cautioned Mr. Bernard, as we have seen. He felt an interest in the young man, a student of his own profession, an intelligent and ingenuously unsuspecting young fellow, who had been thrown by accident into the companionship or the neighborhood of two persons, one of whom he knew to be dangerous, and the other he believed instinctively might be capable of crime. The doctor rode down to the Dudley mansion solely for the sake of seeing old Sophy. He was lucky enough to find her alone in her kitchen. He began talking with her as a physician. He wanted to know how her rheumatism had been. The shrewd old woman saw through all that with her little beady black eyes. It was something quite different he had come for, and old Sophy answered very briefly for her aches and ails. "Old folks' bones ain't like young folks," she said. "It's the Lord's doin's, and 'tain't much matter. I shan't be long round this kitchen. It's the young missus, Doctor. It's our Elsie. It's the baby, as we used to call her. Don't you remember, Doctor? 17 year ago, and her poor mother cryin' for her. Where is she? Where is she? Let me see her." And how I run upstairs, I could run then, and got the coral necklace and put it round her little neck, and then showed her to her mother. And how her mother looked at her, and looked, and then put out her poor thin fingers and lifted the necklace, and fell right back on her pillar, as white as though she was laid out to bury? The doctor answered her by silence, and a look of grave assent. He had never chosen to let old Sophy dwell upon these matters, for obvious reasons. The girl must not grow up haunted by perpetual fears and prophecies, if it were possible to prevent it. "Well, how has Elsie seemed of late?" he said, after this brief pause. The old woman shook her head. Then she looked up at the doctor so steadily and searchingly that the diamond eyes of Elsie herself could hardly have pierced more deeply. The doctor raised his head, by his habitual movement, and met the old woman's look with his own calm and scrutinizing gaze, sharpened by the glasses through which he now saw her. Sophy spoke presently in an awed tone, as if telling a vision. "We shall be having trouble before long. This is somethin' comin' from the Lord. I've had dreams, Doctor. It's many a year I've been a dreamin', but now they're comin' over and over the same thing. 3 times I've dreamed one thing, Doctor, one thing." "And what was that?" the doctor said, with that shade of curiosity in his tone which a metaphysician would probably say is an index of a certain tendency to belief in the superstition to which the question refers. "I can justly tell you what it was, Doctor," the old woman answered, as if bewildered and trying to clear up her recollections. "But it was something fearful, with a great noise and a great cryin' of people, like the last day, Doctor. The Lord have mercy on my poor child, and take care of her, if anything happens. But I'se feared she'll never live to see the last day, if it don't come pretty quick. Poor Sophy, only the 3rd generation from cannibalism, was, not unnaturally, somewhat confused in her theological notions. Some of the Second Advent preachers had been about, and circulated their predictions among the kitchen population of Rockland. This was the way in which it happened that she mingled her fears in such a strange manner with their doctrines. The doctor answered solemnly that of the day and hour we knew not, but it became us to be always ready. "Is there anything going on in the household different from common?" Old Sophy's wrinkled face looked as full of life and intelligence when she turned it full upon the doctor, as if she had slipped off her infirmities and years like an outer garment. All those fine instincts of observation, which came straight to her from her savage grandfather, looked out of her little eyes. She had a kind of faith that the doctor was a mighty conjurer, who, if he would, could bewitch any of them. She had relieved her feelings by her long talk with the minister, but the doctor was the immediate adviser of the family, and had watched them through all their troubles. Perhaps he could tell them what to do. She had but one real object of affection in the world, this child that she had tended from infancy to womanhood. Troubles were gathering thick round her. How soon they would break upon her, and blight or destroy her, no one could tell. But there was nothing in all the catalogue of terrors which might not come upon the household at any moment. Her own wits had sharpened themselves in keeping watch by day and night, and her face had forgotten its age in the excitement which gave life to its features. "Doctor," old Sophy said, "there's strange things goin' on here, by night and by day. I don't like that man, that Dick. I never liked him. He give me somethin' of these to get on. I take 'em 'cause I know it make him mad, if I no take 'em. I wear 'em, so that he needn't feel as if I didn't like him. But, Doctor, I hate him, just as much as a member of the Church has the Lord's leave to hate anybody." Her eyes sparkled with the old savage light, as if her ill will to Mr. Richard Venner might perhaps go a little farther than the Christian limit she had assigned. But remember that her grandfather was in the habit of inviting his friends to dine with him upon the last enemy he had bagged, and that her grandmother's teeth were filed down to points, so that they were as sharp as a shark's. "What is that you have seen about Mr. Richard Venner that gives you such a spite against him, Sophy?" asked the Doctor. "What I seen 'bout Dick Venner?" she replied, fiercely. "I'll tell you what I seen. Dick wants to marry our Elsie. That's what he wants, and he don't love her, Doctor. He hates her, Doctor, as bad as I hate him. He wants to marry our Elsie, and live here in the big house, and have nothin' to do but jest lay still and watch Massa Venner, and see how long it'll take him to die, and if he don't die fast 'nough, help him some way to die fasser. Come close up to me, Doctor. I want tell you somethin'. I told the minister the other day. The minister, he come down and prayed and talked good. He's a good man, that Doctor Honeywood. And I told him all about our Elsie, but he didn't tell nobody what to do to stop all what I've been dreamin' about happening. Come close up to me, Doctor." The Doctor drew his chair close up to that of the old woman. "Doctor, nobody mustn't never marry our Elsie's long she lives. Nobody must never live with Elsie but old Sophy. And old Sophy won't never die as long as Elsie's alive to be took care of. But I'se feared, Doctor, I'se greatly feared Elsie want to marry somebody. There's a young gentleman up at that school where she go, so some of 'em tells me, and she loves to see him and talk with him, and she talks about him when she is asleep sometimes. She must never marry nobody, Doctor. If she do, he die, certain." "If she has a fancy for the young man up at the school there," the Doctor said, "I shouldn't think there would be much danger from Dick." "Doctor, nobody knew nothin' 'bout Elsie but of Sophy. She no like any other creature that ever drew the breath of life. If she can't marry one man 'cause she love him, she marry another man 'cause she hate him." "Marry a man because she hates him, Sophy? No woman ever did such a thing as that, or ever will do it." "Who told you Elsie was a woman, Doctor?" said old Sophy, with a flash of strange intelligence in her eyes. The Doctor's face showed that he was startled. The old woman could not know much about Elsie that he did not know. But what strange superstition had got into her head, he was puzzled to guess. He had better follow Sophy's lead, and find out what she meant. "I should call Elsie a woman, and a very handsome one," he said. "You don't mean that she has any mark about her, except, you know, under the necklace?" The old woman resented the thought of any deformity about her darling. "I didn't say she had nothin', but just that, you know. My beauty have anything ugly? She's the beautifulest shaped lady that ever had a shining silk gown drawed over her shoulders. Only she ain't like no other woman, in none of her ways. She don't cry and laugh like other women, and she hasn't got the same kind of feelings as other women. You know that young gentleman up at the school, Doctor?" "Yes, Sophy, I've met him sometimes. He's a very nice sort of young man, handsome too, and I don't much wonder Elsie takes to him. Tell me, Sophy, what do you think would happen if he should chance to fall in love with Elsie, and she with him, and he should marry her?" "Put your ear close to my lips, Doctor, dear." She whispered a little to the Doctor, then added aloud, "He die, that's all." "But surely, Sophy, you ain't afraid to have Dick marry her, if she would have him for any reason, are you? He can take care of himself, if anybody can." "Doctor," Sophy answered, "nobody can take care of hisself that live with Elsie. Nobody never in all this world must live with Elsie. But, old Sophy, I tell you, you don't think I care for Dick? What do I care if Dick Venner die? He wants to marry our Elsie so as to live in the big house and get all the money and all the silver things and all the chests full of linen and beautiful clothes. That's what Dick wants. And he hates Elsie 'cause she don't like him. But if he marry Elsie, she'll make him die some wrong way or other, and they'll take her and hang her. Or he'll get mad with her and choke her. Oh, I know his chokin' tricks. He don't leave his keys round for nothin'." "What's that you say, Sophy? Tell me what you mean by all that." So poor Sophy had to explain certain facts, not in all respects to her credit. She had taken the opportunity of his absence to look about his chamber, and having found a key in one of his drawers, had applied it to a trunk, and finding that it opened the trunk, had made a kind of inspection for contraband articles, and, seeing the end of a leather thong, had followed it up until she saw that it finished with a noose, which, from certain appearances, she inferred to have seen service of at least doubtful nature. An unauthorized search, but old Sophy considered that a game of life and death was going on in the household, and that she was bound to look out for her darling. The doctor paused a moment to think over this odd piece of information. Without sharing Sophy's belief as to the kind of use this mischievous-looking piece of property had been put to, it was certainly very odd that Dick should have such a thing at the bottom of his trunk. The doctor remembered reading or hearing something about the lasso and the lariat and the bolas, and had an indistinct idea that they had been sometimes used as weapons of warfare or private revenge, but that they were essentially a huntsman's implements after all, and it was not very strange that this young man had brought one of them with him. Not strange, perhaps, but worth noting. "Do you really think Dick means mischief to anybody, that he has such dangerous-looking things?" the doctor said presently. "I tell you, Doctor, Dick means to have Elsie. If he can't get her, he never let nobody else have her. Oh, Dick's a dark man, Doctor. I know him. I 'member him when he was little boy. He always cunning. I think he mean mischief to somebody. He come home late nights, come in softly. Oh, I hear him. I lay awake and got sharp ears. I hear the cats walkin' over the roofs. And I hear Dick Venner when he comes up in his stockin' feet as still as a cat. I think he mean mischief to somebody. I no like his looks these last days. Is that a very purty gentleman up at the schoolhouse, Doctor? I told you he was good looking. What if he is? I should like to see him, Doctor. I should like to see the pretty gentleman that my poor Elsie loves. She mustn't never marry nobody. But, oh, Doctor, I should like to see him, and just think a little how it would have been if the Lord hadn't been so hard on Elsie." She wept and wrung her hands. The kind doctor was touched, and left her a moment to her thoughts. "And how does Mr. Dudley Venner take all this?" he said, by way of changing the subject a little. "Oh, Massa Venner, he good man, but he don't know nothin' 'bout Elsie, as of Sophy do. I keep close by her. I help her when she go to bed, and set by her sometimes when she sleep. I come to her in the morning and help her put on her things." Then, in a whisper, "Doctor, Elsie lets old Sophy take off that necklace for her. What you think she do if anybody else touch it?" "I don't know, I'm sure, Sophy. Strike the person, perhaps." "Oh, yes, strike 'em, but not with her hands, Doctor." The old woman's significant pantomime must be guessed at. "But you haven't told me, Sophy, what Mr. Dudley Venner thinks of his nephew, nor whether he has any notion that Dick wants to marry Elsie." "I tell you, Massa Venner, he good man, but he no see nothin' 'bout what goes on here in the house. He's sort of broken-hearted, you know, sort o' give up, don't know what to do with Elsie, 'cept say yes, yes. Dick always look smilin' and behave well before him. One time I thought Massa Venner believed Dick was going to take Elsie, but now he don't seem to take much notice. He kind o' stupid, like, 'bout such things. It's trouble, Doctor, 'cause Massa Venner bright man naturally, and he's got a great heap o' books. I don't think Massa Venner never been just himself since Elsie was born. He done all he know how, but, Doctor, that wasn't a great deal. You men folks don't know nothin' 'bout these young gals, and if you knowed all the young gals that ever lived, you wouldn't know nothin' 'bout our Elsie. No, but, Sophy, what I want to know is, whether you think Mr. Venner has any kind of suspicion about his nephew, whether he has any notion that he's a dangerous sort of fellow, or whether he feels safe to have him about, or has even taken a sort of fancy to him. Lard bless you, Doctor, Massa Venner no more idea of any mischief 'bout Dick than he has 'bout you or me. You see, he very fond of the Captain, that Dick's father, and he lives so long alone here, 'long with us, that he kind o' like to see mos' anybody that's got any of the family blood in 'em. He hasn't got no more suspicions 'n a baby. You never see such a man in your life. I kind o' think he don't care for nothin' in the world 'xcept just to do what Elsie wants him to. The first year after young Madame die, he do nothin' but just set at the window and look out at her grave, and then come up and look at the baby's neck and say, "It's fadin', Sophy, ain't it?" and then go down in the study and walk, and then kneel down and pray. Doctor, there was 2 places in the old carpet that was all threadbare where his knees had worn 'em. And sometimes, you remember 'bout all that, he'd go off up into the mountain, and be gone all day, and kill all the ugly things he could find up there. Oh, Doctor, I don't like to think of them days. And by he grew kind o' still, and begun to read a little, and at last he got a quiet as a lamb, and that's the way he is now. I think he's got religion, Doctor, but he ain't so bright about what's goin' on, and I don't believe he never suspect nothin' till somethin' happens. For there is somethin' goin' to happen, Doctor, if the last day doesn't come to stop it. And you must tell us what to do, and save my poor Elsie, my baby that the Lord hasn't took care of like all his other children." The Doctor assured the old woman that he was thinking a great deal about them all, and that there were other eyes on Dick besides her own. Let her watch him closely about the house, and he would keep a lookout elsewhere. If there was anything new, she must let him know at once, send up one of the men servants, and he would come down at a moment's warning. There was really nothing definite against the young man, but the Doctor was sure that he was meditating some evil design or other. He rode straight up to the Institute. There he saw Mr. Bernard, and had a brief conversation with him, principally on matters relating to his personal interests. That evening, for some unknown reason, Mr. Bernard changed the place of his desk, and drew down the shades of his windows. Late that night Mr. Richard Venner drew the charge of a rifle, and put the gun back among the fowling pieces, swearing that a leather halter was worth a dozen of it. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25, Part 1 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 25, The Perilous Hour. Up to this time, Dick Venner had not decided on the particular mode and the precise period of relieving himself from the unwarrantable interference which threatened to defeat his plans. The luxury of feeling that he had his man in his power was its own reward. One who watches in the dark, outside, while his enemy, in utter unconsciousness, is illuminating his apartment and himself so that every movement of his head and every button on his coat can be seen and counted, experiences a peculiar kind of pleasure. If he holds a loaded rifle in his hand, which he naturally hates to bring to its climax by testing his skill as a marksman upon the object of his attention. Besides, Dick had two sides in his nature almost as distinct as we sometimes observe in those persons who are the subjects of the condition known as double consciousness. On his New England side he was cunning and calculating, always cautious, measuring his distance before he risked his stroke, as nicely as if he were throwing his lasso. But he was liable to intercurrent fits of jealousy and rage, such as the light-hued races are hardly capable of conceiving, blinding paroxysms of passion, which for the time overmastered him, and which, if they found no ready outlet, transformed themselves into the more dangerous forces that worked through the instrumentality of his cool craftiness. He had failed as yet in getting any positive evidence that there was any relation between Elsie and the schoolmaster, other than such as might exist unsuspected and unblamed between a teacher and his pupil. A book, or a note even, did not prove the existence of any sentiment. At one time he would be devoured by suspicions, at another he would try to laugh himself out of them. And in the meanwhile he followed Elsie's tastes as closely as he could, determined to make some impression upon her, to become a habit, a convenience, a necessity, whatever might aid him in the attainment of the one end which was now the aim of his life. It was to humor one of her tastes already known to the reader that he said to her one morning, "Come, Elsie, take your castanets, and let us have a dance." He had struck the right vein in the girl's fancy, for she was in the mood for this exercise, and very willingly led the way into one of the more empty apartments. What there was in this particular kind of dance which excited her it might not be easy to guess. But those who looked in with the old doctor on a former occasion and saw her will remember that she was strangely carried away by it, and became almost fearful in the vehemence of her passion. The sound of the castanets seemed to make her alive all over. Dick knew well enough what the exhibition would be, and was almost afraid of her at these moments, for it was like the dancing mania of Eastern devotees, more than the ordinary light amusement of joyous youth, a convulsion of the body and the mind, rather than a series of voluntary modulated motions. Elsie rattled out the triple measure of a saraband. Her eyes began to glitter more brilliantly, and her shape to undulate in freer curves. Presently she noticed that Dick's look was fixed upon her necklace. His face betrayed his curiosity. He was intent on solving the question why she always wore something about her neck. The chain of mosaics she had on at that moment displaced itself at every step, and he was peering with malignant, searching eagerness to see if an unsunned ring of fairer hue than the rest of the surface, or any less easily explained peculiarity, were hidden by her ornaments. She stopped suddenly, caught the chain of mosaics and settled it hastily in its place, flung down her castanets, drew herself back, and stood looking at him, with her head a little on one side, and her eyes narrowing in the way he had known so long and well. "What's the matter, Cousin Elsie? What do you stop for?" he said. Elsie did not answer, but kept her eyes on him, full of malicious light. The jealousy which lay covered up under his surface thoughts took the opportunity to break out. "You wouldn't act so if you were dancing with Mr. Langdon, would you, Elsie?" he asked. It was with some effort that he looked steadily at her to see the effect of his question. Elsie colored, not much, but still perceptibly. Dick could not remember that he had ever seen her show this mark of emotion before, in all his experience of her fitful changes of mood. It had a singular depth of significance, therefore, for him. He knew how hardly her colour came. Blushing means nothing in some persons. In others it betrays a profound inward agitation, a perturbation of the feelings far more trying than the passions which, with many easily moved persons, break forth in tears. All who have observed much are aware that some men, who have seen a good deal of life in its less chastened aspects, and are anything but modest, will blush often and easily, while there are delicate and sensitive women who can faint or go into fits if necessary, but are very rarely seen to betray their feelings in their cheeks, even when their expression shows that their inmost soul is blushing scarlet. Presently she answered, abruptly and scornfully, "Mr. Langdon is a gentleman, and would not vex me as you do." "A gentleman!" Dick answered, with the most insulting accent. "A gentleman! Come, Elsie, you've got the Dudley blood in your veins, and it doesn't do for you to call this poor, sneaking schoolmaster a gentleman." He stopped short. Elsie's bosom was heaving. The faint flush on her cheek was becoming a vivid glow. Whether it were shame or wrath, he saw that he had reached some deep lying centre of emotion. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. With another girl these signs of confusion might mean little or nothing. With her they were decisive and final. Elsie Venner loved Bernard Langdon. The sudden conviction, absolute, overwhelming, which rushed upon him, had well nigh led to an explosion of wrath, and perhaps some terrible scene which might have fulfilled some of old Sophy's predictions. This, however, would never do. Dick's face whitened with his thoughts, but he kept still until he could speak calmly. "I've nothing against the young fellow," he said, "only I don't think there's anything quite good enough to keep the company of people that have the Dudley blood in them. You ain't as proud as I am. I can't quite make up my mind to call a schoolmaster a gentleman, though this one may be well enough. I've nothing against him, at any rate." Elsie made no answer, but glided out of the room and slid away to her own apartment. She bolted the door and drew her curtains close. Then she threw herself on the floor and fell into a dull, slow ache of passion, without tears, without words, almost without thoughts. So she remained, perhaps, for a half hour, at the end of which time it seemed that her passion had become a sullen purpose. She arose, and, looking cautiously round, went to the hearth, which was ornamented with curious old Dutch tiles, with pictures of Scripture subjects. One of these represented the lifting of the brazen serpent. She took a hairpin from one of her braids, and, insinuating its points under the edge of the tile, raised it from its place. A small leaden box lay under the tile, which she opened, and, taking from it a little white powder, which she folded in a scrap of paper, replaced the box and the tile over it. Whether Dick had by any means got a knowledge of this proceeding, or whether he only suspected some unmentionable design on her part, there is no sufficient means of determining. At any rate, when they met, an hour or two after these occurrences, he could not help noticing how easily she seemed to have got over her excitement. She was very pleasant with him. Too pleasant, Dick thought. It is not Elsie's way to come out of a fit of anger so easily as that. She had contrived some way of letting off her spite. That was certain. Dick was pretty cunning, as old Sophy had said, and, whether or not he had any means of knowing Elsie's private intentions, watched her closely, and was on his guard against accidents. For the first time he took certain precautions with reference to his diet, such as were quite alien to his common habits. On coming to the dinner-table that day he complained of headache, took but little food, and refused the cup of coffee which Elsie offered him, saying that it did not agree with him when he had these attacks. Here was a new complication. Obviously enough, he could not live in this way, suspecting everything but plain bread and water, and hardly feeling safe in meddling with them. Not only had this school-keeping wretch come between him and the scheme by which he was to secure his future fortune, but his image had so infected his cousin's mind that she was ready to try on him some of those tricks which, as he had heard hinted in the village, she had once before put in practice upon a person who had become odious to her. Something must be done, and at once, to meet the double necessities of this case. Every day, while the young girl was in these relations with the young man, was only making matters worse. They could exchange words and looks. They could arrange private interviews. They would be stooping together over the same book, her hair touching his cheek, her breath mingling with his, all the magnetic attractions drawing them together with strange, invisible effluences. As her passion for the schoolmaster increased, her dislike to him, her cousin, would grow with it, and all his dangers would be multiplied. It was a fearful point he had reached. He was tempted at one moment to give up all his plans and to disappear suddenly from the place, leaving with the schoolmaster, who had come between him and his object, an anonymous token of his personal sentiments, which would be remembered a good while in the history of the town of Rockland. This was but a momentary thought. The great Dudley property could not be given up in that way. Something must happen at once to break up all this order of things. He could think of but one providential event adequate to the emergency, an event foreshadowed by various recent circumstances, but hitherto floating in his mind only as a possibility. Its occurrence would at once change the course of Elsie's feelings, providing her with something to think of besides mischief, and remove the accursed obstacle which was thwarting all his prospects. Every possible motive, then, his interest, his jealousy, his longing for revenge, and now his fears for his own safety, urged him to regard the happening of a certain casualty as a matter of simple necessity. This was the self-destruction of Mr. Bernard Langdon. Such an event, though it might be surprising to many people, would not be incredible, nor without many parallel cases. He was poor, a miserable fag, under the control of that mean wretch up there at the school, who looked as if he had sour buttermilk in his veins instead of blood. He was in love with a girl above his station, rich and of old family, but strange in all her ways, and it was conceivable that he should become suddenly jealous of her, or she might have frightened him with some display of her peculiarities, which had filled him with a sudden repugnance in the place of love. Any of these things were credible, and would make a probable story enough, so thought Dick over to himself with the New England half of his mind. Unfortunately, men will not always take themselves out of the way when, so far as their neighbors are concerned, it would be altogether the most appropriate and graceful and acceptable service they could render. There was at this particular moment no special reason for believing that the schoolmaster meditated any violence to his own person. On the contrary, there was good evidence that he was taking some care of himself. He was looking well and in good spirits, and in the habit of amusing himself and exercising, as if to keep up his standard of health, especially of taking certain evening walks, before referred to, at an hour when most of the Rockland people had retired, or, in vulgar language, gone to bed. Dick Venner settled it, however, in his own mind, that Mr. Bernard Langdon must lay violent hands upon himself. He even went so far as to determine the precise hour, and the method in which the rash act, as it would undoubtedly be called in the next issue of the Rockland Weekly Universe, should be committed. Time, this evening. Method, asphyxia, by suspension. It was unquestionably taking a great liberty with a man to decide that he should become felo de se without his own consent. Such, however, was the decision of Mr. Richard Venner with regard to Mr. Bernard Langdon. If everything went right, then, there would be a coroner's inquest to-morrow upon what remained of that gentleman, found suspended to the branch of a tree somewhere within a mile of the Apollinean Institute.
the Weekly Universe would have a startling paragraph announcing a sad event, which had thrown the town into an intense state of excitement. Mr. Bernard Langdon, a well-known teacher at the Apollinian Institute, was found, etc., etc. The vital spark was extinct. The motive to the rash act can only be conjectured, but is supposed to be disappointed affection. The name of an accomplished young lady of the highest respectability and great beauty is mentioned in connection with this melancholy occurrence. Dick Venner was at the tea-table that evening, as usual. No, he would take green tea, if she pleased, the same that her father drank. It would suit his headache better. Nothing, he was obliged to her. He would help himself, which he did in a little different way from common, naturally enough, on account of his headache. He noticed that Elsie seemed a little nervous while she was rinsing some of the teacups before their removal. "There's something going on in that witch's head," he said to himself. "I know her. She'd be savage now if she hadn't got some trick in hand. Let's see how she looks to-morrow." Dick announced that he should go to bed early that evening on account of this confounded headache which had been troubling him so much. In fact, he went up early and locked his door after him, with as much noise as he could make. He then changed some part of his dress so that it should be dark throughout, slipped off his boots, drew the lasso out from the bottom of the contents of his trunk, and, carrying that and his boots in his hand, opened his door softly, locked it after him, and stole down the back stairs so as to get out of the house unnoticed. He went straight to the stable and saddled the mustang. He took a rope from the stable with him, mounted his horse, and set forth in the direction of the Institute. Mr. Bernard, as we have seen, had not been very profoundly impressed by the old doctor's cautions. Enough, however, to follow out some of his hints, which were not troublesome to attend to. He laughed at the idea of carrying a loaded pistol about with him, but still it seemed only fair, as the old doctor thought so much of the matter, to humor him about it. As for not going about when and where he liked, for fear he might have some lurking enemy, that was a thing not to be listened to, nor thought of. There was nothing to be ashamed of or troubled about in any of his relations with the schoolgirls. Elsie, no doubt, showed a kind of attraction towards him, as did perhaps some others, but he had been perfectly discreet, and no father or brother or lover had any just cause of quarrel with him. To be sure, that dark young man at the Dudley mansion house looked as if he were his enemy when he had met him, but certainly there was nothing in their relations to each other, or in his own to Elsie, that would be like to stir such malice in his mind as would lead him to play any of his wild southern tricks at his, Mr. Bernard's, expense. Yet he had a vague feeling that this young man was dangerous, and he had been given to understand that one of the risks he ran was from that quarter. On this particular evening he had a strange, unusual sense of some impending peril. His recent interview with the doctor, certain remarks which had been dropped in his hearing, but above all an unaccountable impression upon his spirits, all combined to fill his mind with a foreboding conviction that he was very near some overshadowing danger. It was as the chill of the ice mountain toward which the ship is steering under full sail. He felt a strong impulse to see Helen Darley and talk with her. She was in the common parlor, and fortunately alone. "Helen," he said, for they were almost like brother and sister now, "I have been thinking about what you would do if I should have to leave the school at short notice, or be taken away suddenly by any accident." "Do?" she said, her cheek growing paler than its natural delicate hue. "Why, I do not know how I could possibly consent to live here if you left us. Since you came, my life has been almost easy. Before, it was getting intolerable. You must not talk about going, my dear friend. You have spoiled me for my place. Who is there here that I can have any true society with but you? You would not leave us for another school, would you?" "No, no, my dear Helen," Mr. Bernard said. "If it depends on myself, I shall stay out my full time, and enjoy your company and friendship. But everything is uncertain in this world. I have been thinking that I might be wanted elsewhere, and called when I did not think of it. It was a fancy, perhaps, but I can't keep it out of my mind this evening. If any of my fancies should come true, Helen, there are 2 or 3 messages I want to leave with you. I have marked a book or 2 with a cross in pencil on the fly-leaf. These are for you. There is a little hymn book I should like to have you give Elsie from me. It may be a kind of comfort to the poor girl." Helen's eyes glistened as she interrupted him. "What do you mean? You must not talk so, Mr. Langdon. Why, you never looked better in your life. Tell me now, you are not in earnest, are you, but only trying a little sentiment on me?" Mr. Bernard smiled, but rather sadly. "About half in earnest," he said. "I have had some fancies in my head. Superstitions, I suppose. At any rate, it does no harm to tell you what I should like to have done, if anything should happen. Very likely nothing ever will. Send the rest of the books home, if you please, and write a letter to my mother. And, Helen, you will find one small volume in my desk, enveloped and directed you will see to whom. Give this with your own hands. It is a keepsake." The tears gathered in her eyes. She would not speak at first. Presently, "Why, Bernard, my dear friend, my brother, it cannot be that you are in danger. Tell me what it is, and if I can share it with you, or counsel you in any way, it will only be paying back the great debt I owe you." "No, no, it can't be true. You are tired and worried, and your spirits have got depressed. I know what that is. I was sure one winter that I should die before spring, but I lived to see the dandelions and buttercups go to seed. Come, tell me it was nothing but your imagination." She felt a tear upon her cheek, but would not turn her face away from him. It was the tear of a sister. "I am really in earnest, Helen," he said. "I don't know that there is the least reason in the world for these fancies. If they all go off and nothing comes of them, you may laugh at me if you like. But if there should be any occasion, remember my requests. You don't believe in presentiments, do you?" "Oh, don't ask me, I beg you," Helen answered. "I have had a good many frights for every one real misfortune I have suffered. Sometimes I have thought I was warned beforehand of coming trouble, just as many people are of changes in the weather, by some unaccountable feeling. But not often, and I don't like to talk about such things. I shouldn't think about these fancies of yours. I don't believe you have exercised enough. Don't you think it's confinement in the school that has made you nervous?" "Perhaps it has. But it happens that I have thought more of exercise lately, and have taken regular evening walks, besides playing my old gymnastic tricks every day." They talked on many subjects, but through all he said Helen perceived a pervading tone of sadness, and an expression as of a dreamy foreboding of unknown evil. They parted at the usual hour, and went to their several rooms. The sadness of Mr. Bernard had sunk into the heart of Helen, and she mingled many tears with her prayers that evening, earnestly entreating that he might be comforted in his days of trial, and protected in his hour of danger. Chapter 25.